Okay, welcome to the lecture about Neoclassicism. So there's a lot of changes that happen, which is why I'm showing you this map right now. During the Industrial Revolution, which I'd already kind of talked about. Basically, when we say Industrial Revolution, we mean capitalism, when capitalism starts. So with the advent of capitalism, and I already alluded to it before, it creates new classes of people. The first thing are the capitalist industrialists, the people that own these businesses. And they're different than previous royalty because they don't necessarily have to be born into this life. Although, as you know, today, oftentimes they are. And then factory workers. And the reason why this is a new class of people, because workers beforehand, they were usually attached to land or they had some kind of skill, like they'd be like a blacksmith or something along those lines. With factory workers, they don't have skills, and there's no responsibility basically for the industrialists for these workers. And as a result, there's a big conflict between the two, and we start to see the development of socialism. That's a reaction to capitalism. So before that, we have political revolutions. And I should put the democratic in quotes, democratic governments in France and the US. If you live in the US, you know that democracy is somewhat limited as far as people having power. That's literally what it means. And we see the same thing in France. In some ways, the revolutions in France and the US, if you look into them, they had a lot of good values that were behind them. But also at the same time, they were um, mostly in the service of these capitalists, industrialists, and landowners. That was certainly the case in the US. And eventually they had these, shall we say, capitalist revolutions over much of Europe. And this really affected the growth of cities, um, the plight of the working class, especially, and the power of this new capitalist class. So at the end of the 18th century, we kind of see the end of what is called the Enlightenment. And Newton is part of it. He had lived in the previous century. So part of the Enlightenment is basically modern scientific method. So Newton, Galileo, those types of figures started to look at how to explain the world in a way that is mathematical and extremely rational. And they started to come up with things that were unintuitive. We also see the development of science in service of industry uh, as well. And with theoretical science, we start to see it get really far away from what's intuitive. So, development of what we had talked about before. We have Locke, who's a political philosopher, basically, is what we call him nowadays. And many of the revolutionaries, and remember, these not revolutionaries in a modern sense. These are people who are already wealthy who are basically trying to get rid of the monarchy. Although regular people in France and the U.S. were interested in in this revolution. So Locke was kind of putting the political philosophy behind some of these revolutions, and then Voltaire, who was kind of more interesting than Locke in a way, and that Voltaire wrote about people, and he wrote about things like the hypocrisy of power. So some of these people actually looked back to ancient Greece and Rome, kind of like what we saw with the Renaissance, as models for what they were doing. And again, we see the United States be founded during this time, and it's basically founded as an empire from the very beginning. It starts out in these 13 colonies, but one of the ideas behind the revolution is to expand into the area that is occupied by Native Americans and to move them out of the way by any means necessary. So kind of know that where you're living in Michigan and you're sitting on imperial ground in the American empire. So a picture like this from Jacques-Louis David, The Oath of the Horatii, it talks about this idea, which develops in some people during the French Revolution, that a revolution, people get hurt, they die, but the cause for a new nation that is hopefully democratic, it didn't quite turn out that way, is more important than personal issues. So whenever you first look at this painting, like when I brought it up, the first thing you probably looked at was right in the middle where the swords are. And Davi is doing that on purpose. He's letting you know. He's basically making X marks a spot. So what he's telling us by putting this in the center, you can see it's between these three columns, making the main figure wear a red cloak, which was very obvious, and then having all these figures pointing towards it. This is the important part. And these things, which are off on the side, are less important. So for him, for Davi, art had to have a purpose. So none of this Baroque perfume gardens type of business. Instead, it had to have a message. So if you were to place him in a Rubenista or a Poisonista, he's definitely a Poisonista. So the story of this picture comes from ancient Rome. And it's basically about more or less a family feud between the Horatii, and this is Horatius, the head of the Horatii family, and the Curatii. So Curatius, who's the head of that family. And they decide to resolve this long-standing feud by having three of the sons on each side of the family battle. And the winner, and this means someone's going to die, would get what they want and would end the feud forever. So we can see that Horatius's sons are pledging to die for their family. But remember, Davi, he's saying, this isn't family, this is a nation. So like the new French Revolution is what he's talking about. And on the side, we see something, and he's purposely putting this in the side because he doesn't think this is important. One of the Horatio's sisters is dating one of the Curatii. So she is very upset because either she's going to lose a boyfriend or she's going to lose a brother. And then the same thing with the other women in the family, they have emotional feelings about it. So what we're kind of seeing here is you might notice that all the lines on the men are straight lines. We're making triangles and X's, whereas the lines on the women are all curved. So this kind of idea of curved lines representing emotion and straight lines representing something rational is something that continues. And I'm not saying it's rational because I think this is just as important. But what Davi is trying to show us is that he believes that this is the most important, the sacrifice for nationhood. So he, like the ancient Greeks and like the ancient Egyptians, if you studied them, wanted to make everything in a canon proportion. So he made grids and made sure that the people fit into the grids very well and proportioned just right as the ancient Greek sculptures. And then with these ones, he even fit the women into grids, but you can see how their curves don't quite match up with the squares. So this one is another kind of revolutionary type of subject. It's the death of Marat, who was a revolutionary writer. And just like in the United States, there were a lot of revolutionaries who really did want to bring about democracy. So they really wanted the regular folks to have power. It didn't really turn out that way, but that's what they wanted. So Marat was one of those people. He was a journalist. And he had this skin condition, which meant he had to kind of be in the bath with these treatments in a bathtub. And he worked all day with this board that he put across the bathtub. So during the French Revolution, as today, it's making me think of things. There are regular people who are on the side of the elites. And they would see Marat as an enemy because he was a revolutionary trying to bring down the elites. And one of those people came in, made her way into Marat's chamber, and murdered him. So we're seeing, interestingly, Davi, who may or may not be religious, is kind of showing him like Michelangelo's Christ from Pietà and showing the murder weapon right here. He was supposedly stabbed in the heart, so if you saw this in real life, there'd be a lot more blood. But he doesn't want us to concentrate on the blood. He wants us to concentrate on the sacrifice, almost showing him as a martyr. But instead of a martyr for Jesus, he's a martyr for the cause of revolution. So showing him exactly as Michelangelo's Jesus. So another type of sacrifice. And then Charlotte Corday, Marie-Anne Charlotte Corday, was the murderer. And she wrote a note. I am being persecuted for the sake of liberty. I am unhappy. This is sufficient to give me the right. So in other words, he's saying other people's freedom is encroaching on my freedom. and that's why she murdered Marat. So a lot of these neoclassic paintings, they're talking about these heroic and violent images, but unlike what we saw in the Baroque and unlike what we'll see later on in Romantic, they de-emphasize the violence. So in this one, we're seeing the death of General Wolfe, and everyone's focused on it. It's kind of like Giotto, like we saw in the beginning of the class. We kind of see all the lines leading towards him. And he was shot and he's dying, but look, he's wearing this white cloak and there's no blood. Again, they're trying to kind of emphasize the sacrifice. So a lot of times you're probably wondering, they're using these religious type imagery, but without religious people. So it's almost like there's a shift of allegiance from religion to nationalism. And a lot of people see nationalism as a religion in itself. And if you live in the United States, you can certainly kind of feel that kind of sort of thing. And in this one, and sometimes this is about the so-called French and Indian War. It's a war between the French and the United States. United States, well, what would become the United States, the colonists wanted to expand westward, and the French didn't want them to. So they found some Native American groups that were on their side, and they fought against the British, against the French. So the English, since they still ran the colonies, they sent their people to kind of put down the French and the Native Americans that were on their side, but they did find some Native Americans on their side, and that's what General Wolfe is showing here. So this is relatively realistic compared to what you usually see. So like Giotto, we see a similar type of idea, again, like secular saints almost. Right there, it's pretty much the same composition. Another thing we see, and this is almost like early Romanticism more than anything, is this painting, an example of which is in the DIA. And I highly recommend seeing it in person because it's pretty neat. It's Watson and the Shark. And this is probably the first painting that's about what you would call like a tabloid story. So think about like when you read in the news, you hear about like somebody did this crazy thing, like they ran naked through City Hall and then they put a story about it. Or things about serial killers or about robbers or something like that. Those kind of stories weren't the types of things that you would see in paintings until this time. So this is probably the first one. Watson is a person who fell off of a boat and he was attacked by a shark. So as you might imagine, Copley probably hadn't seen too many sharks, so it doesn't look very much like a shark. But this is a real person, and he told his story, which is also interesting. Usually only elites could tell their stories. So we are getting a little bit of democracy at this time. And it represents this guy's real story. He fell into the water, he tried to strip so he wouldn't sink, but he had been bitten by the shark. And he kind of makes it dramatic. We can see all the figures trying to save their buddy Watson, who had gone overboard. So this is the version at the DIA. I kind of like it better. So the depiction of this noteworthy event in an ordinary person's life was an American innovation. So National Gallery of Art's trying to be a little patriotic here. So I'm coming back to Vijay Lebrun because of how she used classical Roman clothes to kind of say that something is universal and rational. So in other words, love is rational. The reason why I'm explaining this is because other painters kind of went with the same thing. This is Angelica Kauffman. It's Cornelia presenting her children as her treasures. And it's a story from ancient Rome, which is kind of, in a way, probably not the best story for today, because I would say that it kind of puts women in a role that they don't necessarily, that not all women want to be in. But it shows Cornelia's meeting with her friend, their friend showing her all her jewels and dresses and stuff. And she's like, these are my treasures, my children. And by making this story in ancient Rome, again, it's kind of adding some weight to it, like Vijay Lebrun did with the family. It says, this is right and natural, the way things should be. So we have Udon, who is showing Voltaire, and he's showing him as if he's Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher. So Voltaire never dressed like this, but Voltaire was kind of known for being a writer and a critic. So think of satires that you might like. That's what Voltaire was. And he could destroy anyone in a conversation. You know, he always had to come back ready. But he also had a lot of concern for regular people. Like, I read a cool essay he had that was speaking up about how it was difficult for women to get divorces and they would have to stay in abusive relationships as a result. So he was one of those punching up type people. He would look at powerful people and criticize them, but regular folks, he tried to raise them up and show their concerns. So Udan is showing Voltaire as, Socrates, who sacrificed himself rather than change the way he taught his students. I don't know if I could do that. We see it again, like Voltaire's got kind of like a brightness in his eyes, his brow's a little furrowed, but he's doing a little smile. So he always tried to have fun with the types of criticisms that he would do. Um, that's the face of someone that you don't want to mess with. So the last one is Thomas Jefferson, who was a president, obviously, and a slave owner, which is going to become important to know in a moment. And this is Monticello. You know you're important if your personal home has a name that's separate from yourself. So Jefferson, though, also designed the home and the grounds. So Jefferson was kind of like a new sort of Renaissance type of person where he had a lot of skills. And he puts a lot of classical elements. In other words, things from ancient Rome and Greece, like the pillars, the dome, this pediment you would see in Greek sculptures, but also fits it into the American environment with the brick facing and the shutters on the windows and using relatively natural plants. He also imported plants. He's famous importing trees. But the dark side of this, and it's kind of the dark side of every powerful person in early America, is that he was a slave owner. And he actually had set up underground chambers so he could go and visit the slaves who he raped and had children with. So the classicism becomes kind of like the style of the United States. And in a way, it adds this universality and, kind of eternal nature to the United States. But I think it's important in this class to always remember that that's built on the oppression of others.